Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. For today's episode, as you may have guessed from the title, we're going to take a deep dive beneath the fantasy iceberg. So, let's start at the top. What is fantasy? Simply put, fantasy is fiction that involves fantastical, magical, mystical, or mythological elements. Often, the world is different from our own. More often than not, it takes place in its own world. But there's also special rules that fantasy follows. Now, before we get too deep into things, there's a few subgenres that we need to identify. Those are high fantasy, low fantasy, sword and sorcery, and contemporary or urban fantasy. Some sources online will identify other important subgenres, but these four are the primary. The vast majority of all true fantasy stories can be placed in one of these four categories. The others are mostly blend genres, which combine fantasy with another genre. Examples of that are science fantasy, fantastique, grimdark, the punks, such as steampunk or gaslamp, and weird fiction. But back to the four primary subgenres. What separates them is the amount of fantastical elements that they contain, and we'll get to those. But first, the genres. High fantasy is an epic tale that involves a high number of fantastical elements. Low fantasy is one that involves a small number or limited amount of fantastical elements. Sword and sorcery is somewhere between the two. And last up is urban or contemporary fantasy. The primary driving force behind this subgenre is the fact that it's set modern day, often in large cities, hence the urban part. This is what separates it from the others, which typically have a medieval Europe style setting. Beyond that, urban fantasy can involve any number of fantastical elements, though for many, it's a lower number, perhaps closer to sword and sorcery or even low fantasy. But overall, urban or contemporary fantasy is not restrained by these numbers. Now, some will separate urban and contemporary, but really, they're so similar, they might as well be the same thing. Historically, yes, large urbanized cities existed. Rome is a good example. Athens, even London. Yet the majority of descriptions out there for urban fantasy place it in a contemporary urban environment. Where would a separation between contemporary and urban happen? Say if your story was set in the suburbs or the countryside, something of this nature, modern day, but not in a big city. Now, even though urban is one of the key words, the setting you choose may not be an actual modern city, but it's something that would feel analogous, something that would feel accurate by today's standards, one that would feel realistic, which means don't rule out a fictionalized version of New York or London, or actual versions of today's world. Both of those are acceptable for urban and contemporary fantasy. Now, as I said, typically the setting for the vast majority of fantasy stories is a medieval Europe period. However, a different historical time period or different setting is also possible. Now, look, I know that I am glossing over perhaps the most important part. I can say high fantasy involves 4 or more fantastical elements, to which you might say, that's great, but what does that mean? What makes fantasy fantasy? So let's talk about that. And then we can start applying some of this knowledge. The elements that act as hallmarks of the fantasy genre can be put into categories. When we say fantastical element categories, what we mean are creatures, trope characters, magic, realms, non-human races, fantastical places, and fantastical items. But remember, traditional fantasy also has a time period. It has the look and technological level of medieval Europe. And the important part here is technological level. It is certainly possible to go forward or backward in terms of technological level within your story, but that does need to be identified and understood. But this also means we need to do a video on time periods, because every writer should know the names of these periods and the technology levels they involve. But that's not today's topic. Just know that changing the time period in a fantasy tale results in a wildly different world with each switch. Just something to remember. Now, typically, a high fantasy story will have several elements from each category, sometimes even all of one category, and the amounts lower with each subgenre. But what are those elements? In the creature category, there are such things as dragons, drakes, wyverns, elementals, fairies, spirits, undead, rocks, abnormally large creatures, centaurs, griffins, unicorns, naga, lich, however you say it, minotaurs, manticores, and yes, there is a difference between dragon, drake, and wyvern. Now, this isn't all of the fantastical creatures, but it should give you an idea. These are some very common ones that you'll see often. They're not the only ones. Next up is trope characters. This could be a typical profession that one might see in the time period, such as a blacksmith. But it could also be something like a paladin. Ones you are likely to see are ranger, wizard or witch, druids, bards, clerics, and rogues, to say nothing of kings, queens, and other royalty. Another big element group is magic. This is perhaps the most common fantastical element group in the genre. How magic works in fantasy varies from story to story. Is it something slightly visual? Is it spoken? Can you see magic happening? You'll have to figure out how magic works in your world, and whether or not it's hard or soft magic. Hard magic has rules that are set in stone. Everyone and everything abides by them. They do not change. They do not bend. This is how magic works. Conversely, soft magic is a little more mutable. It can bend as the need arises. Perhaps one school of magic works a little bit differently from another. Maybe there's even subtle things that differentiate how magic works in your world. A good way of looking at this would be the subtleties in language. Take homophones, which are words that are spelled the same but have different meanings. Magic can work in the same way, be just as subtle, but it's up to you to decide those rules. And once you set them, you need to keep them. Another element group to consider is that of realms. For this, we're talking about different planes of existence. Typically, a story will take place on the physical plane, in a physical realm, but there could also be another realm, a spectral realm, the astral plane, or the shadow realm. Some include places like an enchanted forest in this category, but I'd prefer to put that in a different one, and that would be fantastical places. This is where you get a lot of your mystical location, but also includes castles and keeps, grand walls, or giant statues. Some of these fantastical places are just typical locations within a fantasy world, but for others, it's places on the physical plane, in the physical realm, where the rules operate a little differently. Maybe there's more magic or more evil. Maybe there's lots of fantastical creatures. The contents of these places is up to you. Something to think about in the planning phase while you're designing your new world. Then you have one of the more visible elements, which is non-human races. This is where you'll find dwarves, elves, orcs, goblins, trolls, ogres, and many other humanoid beings. Now, one thing to note, well, two things. First being, these are typical fantasy literature races. There is a tabletop role-playing game that has more, but I'd steer away from anything created for that game. Really, you're just better off creating your own. But if you want to have something similar, the best idea is to come up with a new name and a new backstory for that race. The same can be said for anthropomorphic animals. This means either humans with animal traits or animals with human traits, which could be nothing more than the humanoid silhouette. But you'll need to decide how they came to be if you plan to include them. The last major category is items. This can be anything from weapons to potions, which means knowledge of time period accurate armor and weapons is going to be a good thing. But items could also mean elements unique to your world. A good example here would be Mithril, created by Tolkien. Now, high fantasy, as I said, will typically have elements from all of these categories. Sometimes all of one category and the majority of the others. By contrast, low fantasy will have a minimal amount, maybe just magic, or magic and a few mystical creatures. There's a lot of interpretation that goes into the fantasy genre, but the vast majority is defined by the author. A good way to look at it is probably a spectrum. On one end is Lord of the Rings, the classic example of high fantasy. On the other end would be something like Harry Potter or Conan the Barbarian, classic examples of low fantasy, with Harry Potter also being urban or contemporary fantasy. Now, everyone wants their idea to be unique. I know I do. But to get readers interested, you have to be able to liken it to something else. That's why being able to compare your fantasy story to another one, somewhere on the spectrum, is a good idea. It lets people know what kind of adventure they're in for. Now, if you want to give the spectrum numbers so it's a little easier to grasp, we can do that too. On the high end would be Lord of the Rings at a 10. On the low end, Harry Potter or Conan the Barbarian at a 1. High fantasy, low fantasy. And between them falls Sword and Sorcery, which comes in at a 5 on the numbered scale. How about another famous series, Game of Thrones? Well, the TV series may come in at about a 4, but the book series comes in at a 6 or a 7, maybe even higher. There's a lot more fantastical elements in the books than made it into the show, but that's another video. What this spectrum allows is for you to figure out what stories out there you want yours to be like. What do you want it to be close to? Do you want minimal fantastical intrusion or maximum? Do the elements benefit or hinder your main storyline? Points to consider on your journey into fantasy. But there's a lot more you need to consider. Fans of the fantasy genre expect big books, tomes. And the reason for this is quite simple. The layering and lore needed to make a good fantasy story is extensive. There's lots of descriptions, lots of emotions, lots of things that take up page space. Considering the vast majority of fantasy stories have literally thousands of years of history baked into them, the necessary lore to create that history is extensive. In essence, think of our own world history. We have a written account, a recorded history timeline that goes back to ancient Egypt and a little bit beyond to Mesopotamia. Maybe a little bit earlier, but around 3000 BCE, perhaps even as early as 4000 BCE. Even older if you include cave paintings. But let's go with the first written word. That means over 5,000 years of history. Now, do you have to explain all of that history in one sitting? No. In fact, absolutely not. But you do need to provide a large chunk of that history, distributed as small pieces all throughout your story. New locations often come with new history lessons. Also, considering that most high fantasy tales are considered epics, your story needs to be exactly that. Epic. High fantasy stories will often involve a large scale, a grand scale. They involve the whole world. Huge battles, wars, thousands of people fighting, despite focused on one or a handful of main characters. You see this with Lord of the Rings. It takes place over the entirety of Middle-earth. But the main focus is members of the Fellowship. Conversely, low fantasy is more intimate, more close with the main character. It doesn't have to have such a grand scope. And right in between is sword and sorcery, which has a less grand scale, but it's still there. The focus, however, is on the characters. We're more concerned with them than we are with the wider picture, but it's still there. And that's the difference. And this is another place where Game of Thrones is a good example. The book world is packed with lore and locations and people and stories that the TV show just never explored. But it didn't have time to do so. The main focus of the TV show was the main storyline. So all of the side information took a backseat. But all of those locations, all of those places, all of those mystical elements are discussed, sometimes even at great length in the book, despite being glossed over on the TV show. And there's another big factor when it comes to book length for fantasy. And that's language. The descriptions. Now, you don't have to go into the same detail that Tolkien did, spending multiple pages on just trees or hairy feet. But you do need to constantly paint a picture with your words. In our world, places have feelings, an aura, if you like. You go there, and you get a sense. You can feel a certain type of energy emanating from that location. I'm confident you know that feeling. Visit somewhere, and just being there affects you. Be it a peaceful sense, a frantic feeling, a sense of energy, or one of reverence. Stand in the ruins of the Roman Colosseum, and you can almost hear the ancient crowd cheering. Are they cheering for you? Down on the floor? Or are they cheering around you? But that sense is there. That feel is there. And that's what you have to provide. Now, not everywhere offers that sense of reverence, that feeling of grandeur. Take Times Square in New York City. That offers a much different feeling from the Colosseum. There, the feeling is it's frenetic, it's electric, it's charged. And not just because of the digital billboards. That meaning of the roads feels alive, if nothing else, because there's constantly people there. Places have auras. Places have sensations. For us, we usually feel it around older ones, but newer places can have it too. And your fantasy world needs to evoke this feeling as well. Now, what does all this mean? It means be prepared to write big, to write long. As I said, audiences are willing to accept a tome. If you're not ready to put 150,000 words down in a manuscript, really consider your choice of fantasy. Because 150,000 is a good average. Some books will have a little bit less. Some much, much more. You need to be able to be descriptive, to evoke emotion. You need to be able to write action. There's battles that take place within the pages of a fantasy story. The sounds, the sights, the smells. Tell it all. Be able to lay out thousands of years of history. It doesn't all have to make it into the story, but you do need to know it. Because just like in our world, history affects the present and eventually the future. This means extensive research and planning to world build on the second biggest scale. I say second biggest because the biggest is crafting not one, but multiple worlds. Though that's a little more sci-fi territory. But still, even the world building in fantasy is epic. Even for low fantasy and the other subgenres. The world building is exactly that, building a world. And all of that is needed before you start writing. All the planning, all the research, all the designing, all the building, all the landscape. You need to have it down before you put chapter 1 on the page. Fantasy is an undertaking. It is a Herculean task when done right. George R.R. Martin's books average 300,000 words, and even those are not long enough for all of the lore that he's created. Tolkien invented several languages and then went on to create the blueprint for the genre that we know today. Martin has written over 2 million words in his currently unfinished series. Tolkien wrote over 500,000 words. Rowling wrote over 1 million words in the Harry Potter series. The shortest there at just 80,000 words, with the longest book being over 250,000. Can you do it? Absolutely you can, but you do need to be prepared, not only for the time it takes, but the detail, the lore of any genre. Fantasy will test your world-building abilities more than any other, because you need to create a rich, vibrant world, one that feels alive, one that feels like it has all of that history you've created. All the great stories in the genre share this common trait. They all feel alive. There's long lengths and extensive universes. The history and depth that goes into these stories. But you can do it. You can. You can create something that stands with the greats. But you must be prepared for the journey. You know, originally I said I was going to cover this over several videos, 2, maybe 3. But we've covered a lot in this one. But I can still do another video. If there's something you would like to see me discuss in greater detail, something you feel I've left out, let me know in the comments. In the meantime, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.